We're going tomorrow, Dad. I've sold your company. My father froze. His coffee cup shattered on the marble floor of our Manhattan penthouse. He stared at me, like I'd spoken a foreign language. Richard, furious. What? What did you just say, Ethan? Ethan, you heard me. Reed Global Holdings is no longer yours. His jaw tightened, his voice a growl. You think this is a joke? You're my son. You can't sell my empire, but I smiled, because he had no idea that I already had. And soon, he'd learn why. My name's Ethan Reed, son of Richard Reed, the so-called King of Wall Street. But behind the suits, champagne, and fake smiles was a man who destroyed everything he touched, including my mother. I grew up in a glass tower in Manhattan, a building of mirrors, expensive, cold, and always watching. Our living room looked down on Central Park like it owned it. At night, the city lights stitched together the skyline, and the whole world felt too small for the life my father wanted. Our cars were imported. Our linens cost more than most apartments, and our dinners were quiet, not because we were peaceful, but because fear sat at the head of the table. My father's voice was law. When he spoke, it filled rooms, certified decisions, and dismissed people. He was Richard Reed, a name that opened doors and closed wounds. He wore power like a scent. Everyone noticed it. Everyone bowed to it. My mother, Laura, used to laugh like sunlight. She'd hum in the kitchen and bring cheap flowers home just to brighten the marble. She had a soft way of touching the space between people, like she could mend the things my father's hands had broken. But one winter night changed that. When I was 12, I overheard them arguing. I was supposed to be asleep, but the house has thin walls when they're made of money and secrets. I pressed my ear to their bedroom door and listened. He said it like an order, like it tied her down, like she had no choice. That night, I found my mother in the kitchen, alone under the yellow light of the stove. She was holding a small envelope like you hold a secret you can't throw away. Her hands were shaking. Inside was a divorce paper, unsigned. The ink blurred at the bottom from her tears. She put the envelope back in a drawer and wiped her face with the back of her hand. She tried to smile for me when I walked in. The smile was honest but broken. 3 days later, she was gone. A car crash on the West Side Highway. A headline in the morning paper. Local socialite killed in accident. 2 columns, a photo of our house, a small note from my father about grief. Dad called it an accident. He signed the obituaries. He gave interviews, and he shut the world down with memorized lines. He wore black and looked like a man who lost the last piece of a life. The city believed him. The police quietly closed the file, but something about it never sat right. The way the paramedics looked at him. Not pity, but something that looked like relief. The way the mechanic who fixed his car later disappeared from the papers. The way the divorce papers vanished from the drawer overnight. I called it the beginning of my revenge. Not because I knew how to get him, but because I knew what he'd taken from me, the sunlight in my life, and I couldn't let it go unexplained. As I grew older, he made sure I was polished. He sent me to Yale, a place with ivy, cold stone, and alumni dinners that smelled like old money. Carry the Reed legacy, he told me, tightening the knot of the tie he'd bought for me. What I wanted wasn't to carry a legacy, it was to peel it apart. College gave me something he didn't expect. It gave me perspective. While he taught me corporate aggression, Yale taught me argument, evidence, the way systems are built and can be broken. I sat in classrooms and listened to professors talk about ethics and law. I watched classmates argue for justice and found I could pass numbers the way some men read poetry. At 23, I went to work at Reed Global Holdings. I remember my first day. The security badge weighed heavy. The marble reception smelled of coffee and freshly polished ego. Men in suits shook my hand like I'd already earned something. But in board meetings, he ignored me. He laughed at my ideas like I was a child reciting lines. He once told me in front of the legal team, a sentence that stuck like a scar. It was meant to humiliate me. It did, but humiliation can be a tool. It teaches patience. I studied him. I watched where he kept his papers, the way his assistant carried his schedule like gospel. I learned how meetings were staged, how deals were whispered over lunches in private rooms. Reed Global was a fortress of greed, auditors, shell companies, and smiling men with dark pockets. I started small. I volunteered for late-night audits. I learned to read balance sheets like a map. I made friends with the quiet people, accountants, junior lawyers, the ones who kept their heads down but remembered everything. They were invisible to my father, Invisible people remember everything. There were nights I lay awake thinking of the kitchen light where my mother sat, the unsaid words in my childhood. Nights when I wanted to run into his office and scream to the world what he'd done. But men like him don't fall with a scream. They fall when everyone else turns their backs, legally, publicly, and cleanly. So I waited. I learned patience. I learned to file my anger away like fuel for a machine. I learned that revenge that is rushed is messy. And messy revenge is easy to stop. There were moments of small cruelty that tested me. At a family dinner, he once announced a charity gift in Mum's name and clapped himself on the back while our relatives applauded. I could see the lie baked into the speech as clearly as glass. The room applauded. My chest tightened. I wanted to stand and scream that the donation came from money laundered through the same accounts that paid off the mechanic, that the honor was a curtain. But I sat. I clapped, quiet as a sharpening tool. So I clapped and learned to use patience like a blade. By 27, I had access to more than just meetings. I had passwords, office keys, and the trust small men grant to bigger men's children. He'd handed me the threads to the tapestry he'd woven and told me to help him mend it. He didn't know I was learning how to unravel it. Sometimes the simplest things are the most damning. An inconsistent invoice here, a forged signature there, I started to collect. Not for drama, but for proof. Evidence that could stand in a courtroom. Evidence that could not be dismissed as the ranting of a grieving son. I still remember the smell of his office. Cedar and old paper. I remember the portrait of my grandparents watching over the fireplace like silent judges. I remember the night I found the first real crack. A ledger hidden behind a stack of contracts. A column of numbers that didn't match the official report. It was the kind of thing a son notices only after he decides to look. And so I stayed. I smiled at him in elevators. I opened the car doors. I let him think the war had ended, because sometimes the best revenge is quiet. Years passed. I learned everything. The clients, the shell accounts, the coded emails, the offshore transfers hidden under layers of legalese. Reed Global wasn't a company. It was a machine designed to hide the truth and multiply money. The corruption ran deeper than I expected. What looked like clever accounting in the daylight was a highway for stolen trust at midnight. I started to catalogue everything. A ledger here, an anonymous transfer there. Each line on a spreadsheet was another lie stitched into his empire. One night, the kind of night that feels thinner than others, I stayed late. The office was a graveyard of phone messages and polishing cloths. The city outside was a dark ocean. I told myself I'd only look for inconsistencies. I'd only collect cold facts. That's when I found the safe. It wasn't where I thought it would be. Not behind the painting, not in the drawer labelled legal. It was hidden behind a false back in my father's private cabinet, small enough to be missed by the careless, precise enough for the careful. Inside, files, thick manila folders tied with string, labelled in his handwriting. I flipped one open, photos, police reports, handwritten notes. The pictures were grainy but undeniable. A smashed bumper, a twisted guardrail, tyre marks that didn't match the official report. The police report had a margin note, brake line severed, probable tampering, and beneath it a receipt, cash payment to a mechanic, stamped with Reed Global's client account. My heart stopped. The room rotated. The man who raised me, who taught me to recognize opportunity like other men recognize faces, the man who had sworn to protect our family, had ordered the violence that killed. The only person who trusted him enough to leave. Read the notes like a confession. Names circled, dates underlined. There was a phone number scrawled and a small annotation. Done. R. The kind of shorthand only he would use. For a second, I felt something that wasn't yet rage. It was a sterile, clinical horror. The way you feel when you discover a disease in someone you love. Then rage followed, hot and bright and terrible. I sat down. I put the file back carefully, like handling glass. I walked out of the office and into the cold stairwell. The city air hit my face, and I realized two things at once. 1. My mother's death was no accident. 2. If I reacted now, if I stormed his office, if I screamed and made a scene, the world would swallow the noise. He'd say I was unstable, a grieving son lashing out. He'd spin it into a pity play. His lawyers would bury the file. The evidence would be dismissed as family drama. So I did what he taught me to do. I kept my face calm. I learned from the monster. I tamed the animal inside me and turned it into a plan. I began to map everything. I traced money flows through shell companies with names that smelled like islands and lawyer firms that existed only on paper. I matched dates on my father's calendar with the mechanic's receipt. I cross-checked travel logs, dinner reservations, and security camera timestamps. Each match tightened the noose. Each discovery moved the truth from whisper to evidence. I also found something else: weakness, a pattern of arrogance, a tendency to celebrate victories in private emails, a habit of delegating the messy parts of the dirty work to contractors who thought they were invisible. Men like that always leave fingerprints. And then there was the mechanic's ledger, a small red notebook I found inside a drawer at a local garage after subtle questions and late-night coffees with a man who needed a bit of cash more than his conscience. He remembered the envelope. He remembered the car. He remembered the hand that paid him. When I walked away from that garage, the city felt different. It felt like a place where truth was a currency I could spend. It felt like a place where men like my father were not untouchable. They were merely prepared. I wanted to destroy him immediately. I wanted to rip his name from the world and watch it burn. But his favorite line echoed in my head, the one he used to say at the end of every congratulatory speech. So I planned, not noisy, not dramatic, clean, legal, public, and irreversible. What I did next would change everything. But to get there, I had to become the son he thought he'd lost. The obedient one, the easy target. I had to get closer than anyone suspected. For 2 years I wore the mask he expected. The polite son, the smiling heir. I sat through gala dinners while my hands itched for evidence. I answered his calls in the night, fetched his coffee, learned his jokes. He liked that. He relaxed. He trusted the version of me he'd made. He gave me access, passwords, legal signatory rights. A small block of shares, he joked, were for practice. I accepted them like a man who's been given keys to a locked house. He thought I was becoming him. He even put my picture beside his on the company website for a month, joking to the board, "My son's learning." But I wasn't becoming him. I was building a trap. I started with the smallest legal moves. Transfers that looked like internal reallocations. A name here, a numbered LLC there. I set up legitimate shell entities, law firms, trustees, and accountants who did not ask too many moral questions when the paperwork looked clean. I moved shares slowly, legally, so every transfer looked routine. Each file was stamped, notarized, and defensible. My lawyer told me the truth. If it's legal and in the books, no one can call it theft. At the same time, I made invisible friends. I quietly befriended members of the board who'd been brushed aside by my father's arrogance. I whispered doubts in hallways and over lunches. I fed audited lines to the right people. Anonymous tips, redacted evidence. Enough to put a spotlight on Reed Global's worst corners without pointing directly at me. And then I did something he never imagined. I fed his own crimes to the SEC. Not in a dramatic email signed with my name. No. I compiled a dossier, clean copies, timestamps, transaction trails, and uploaded them through secure channels under aliases and shell proxies. Lawyers will tell you regulation moves slow, but when 100 small irregularities point in the same direction, regulators act fast. I watched from within the machine I'd been raised in as audits began. Small at first, then deeper. He blamed competitors. He blamed bad counsel. He blamed everything but the past he'd built on rotten wood. When the timing was right, when the last legal checkbox had been ticked and my shell companies were above board and irreversible, I signed the final papers. It was dawn. The city was grey and cold. The lobby was empty, but for morning cleaners and a security guard who'd known me since I was a child. I walked in with a document folder under my arm like any other executive. But this folder carried a verdict. Reed Global Holdings was sold, not to a faceless conglomerate or a ruthless competitor, but to a charitable foundation legally registered under my mother's name, the Laura Reed Trust. Every share I'd slowly shifted now converged into control, and the trust's charter was ironclad. Funds used only for women's shelters, legal aid and education. When Dad arrived, suited and with the same hollow confidence he'd always worn, his keycard failed. He swiped it again. Nothing. He frowned, tried another entrance. A guard blocked him politely. His face went from amused to confused to furious in 3 heartbeats. I walked into the lobby. I held the final document in plain sight. I let the slow, ridiculous calm of the moment spread over me. He looked at me as if I'd become a stranger. The same rage that had built his deals now sought a target in my chest. "Dad," I said. My voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that gets into bones. "You always told me business was about power." He laughed, a brittle thing, then lunged forward, voice low and dangerous. I stepped closer, folding my hands around the paper like a proof. "Yes," I said, "I've freed Mum's legacy from your corruption." For a moment, everything held like glass. Then his world crumbled. Not into flames, but into documents and filings and public records that couldn't be spun away. He realized then what I'd done. Every penny he'd hidden offshore, every line used to launder truth into profit, transferred, redirected, and locked into charitable endowments under my mother's name. The accounts were clean. The ownership was legal. The press release was already scheduled by the PR firm I'd quietly instructed weeks earlier. He slammed a hand on the marble and laughed, a sound without humor. "You think you won?" He spat. "This will ruin us. You'll be known as the traitor who sold his family." I didn't answer with anger. I answered with the only thing that mattered. "This isn't about ruin," I told him. "It's about repair. You broke things. I'm trying to fix them." The board meetings that followed would be theatre. His lawyers would circle like sharks. But the tide had turned. Clean moves, legal lines, and a foundation in my mother's name. That was the kind of revenge he couldn't sue away. He tried everything. Lawsuits, smear campaigns, phone calls at 2 a.m. to investors who'd once praised him on magazine covers. He frightened the press and begged his contacts to spin the story. He screamed at his lawyers until their faces went white. But the truth had teeth. The files I'd placed in the right hands, the clean audit trails, the mechanics ledger, the camera timestamps. They were all now in the public record. They weren't whispers anymore. They were hard legal paper that couldn't be rubbed out by a well-placed apology. Then it happened the way it happens when fortunes built on lies finally meet sunlight. The SEC raided Reed Global. I didn't watch it on TV out of schadenfreude. I watched it because I needed to see the final page turn. Cameras swarmed the building I'd known my whole life. Men in suits who once bowed and smiled were escorted out with their hands by their sides, faces shocked into small, human shapes. His empire collapsed the way old buildings collapse. Not with a single thunderclap, but with 100 small structural failures. One by one, bank accounts were frozen. Investors called emergency meetings. Board members turned on him. The man who once controlled rooms found himself shut out of his own offices. And me? I watched from my mother's old beach house. The house he'd sold after her funeral. The one with a porch that looked out over a sting of grey Atlantic and a lawn that smelled of salt and broken promises. I'd bought it back quietly, in cash, through a trust no one linked to me. I needed the quiet. I needed the wind and the sky to match the hollowness I felt. Days blurred into headlines. Friends texted, strangers called, some to celebrate, others to warn that this would get ugly. I let the calls fall to voicemail. I walked the beach at dawn, letting the tide shape my thoughts. A week later, he came. Not in a black limousine, but in a rented sedan with the windows down like a man hoping anonymity could buy him mercy. He looked smaller than the photographs. The suit hung off him instead of shaping him. The arrogance had been scrubbed by panic. He stood at the foot of the porch with a folder in his hand like a last hope. For a moment I thought he might fall to his knees. Instead he whispered my name. I looked at him. The man who taught me strategy and cruelty and how to count risk. The man who had taught me to climb and had shoved my mother off the ladder to do it. There are faces you expect to be certain. His was uncertain now. I stepped down from the porch. The sea smelled of salt. The gulls circled like jury members. I could have spoken with the kind of fury that would tear him open. I could have listed the crimes, the receipts, the receipts, the receipts. But the courtrooms were already busy doing that. Instead, I said what I'd said once before, slow and small because I wanted him to understand every syllable. "We're going tomorrow. Dad, I've sold your company," I smiled, not cruelly, but with the resolved calm of a verdict read aloud. "To the only person who ever deserved it," I said. "To Mom." For a second he looked as if someone had turned off the lights in him. He tried to form an insult, to make it about betrayal instead of justice, but the words wouldn't come. He opened his mouth, closed it, then folded the folder into his chest, like a confession he couldn't throw away. I thought about everything we'd been taught about power, that it's taken, never given. I'd taken it, but not to own. I'd taken it to write a ledger the world should have seen. I had taken his empire and put it where it could do good, not because I wanted him to suffer, but because I wanted to repair the damage he'd done. He stood there, a once great man rendered ordinary. For the first time in his life, Richard Reed had no words that could make the world look the way he wanted it to. I watched him walk away, and in that walk, I saw the cost of a life built on other people's ruin. The cameras would follow him soon, the courts would chase him, but he would not have the thing he'd always cherished most, the illusion of control. I walked back onto the porch and stood where my mother once watched ships come home. I placed my hand on the railing, and for a moment I simply listened. To the sea, to the gulls, to a horizon that didn't care for wealth or guilt. It only moved forward. What happened next would be quieter than the scandal suggested. There would be press conferences and courtroom theatrics, lawyers spinning narratives and old friends choosing sides. But the hardest thing, the thing that kept me awake some nights, was how to honor what I'd taken without becoming the kind of man who takes everything to win. I'd taken his empire and repurposed it. I'd given it a name my mother would have recognized, and in taking it, I'd finally given her back a part of what was stolen. I'd taken his empire and repurposed it. I'd given it a name my mother would have recognized, and in taking it, I'd finally given her back a part of what was stolen. Months passed. Headlines cooled. The cameras moved on to the next scandal. But some things don't just vanish. They linger in small rooms and quieter lives. He retreated, not to public fights, but to a rented house in upstate New York. No press, no gala invitations, just mornings that tasted of cold coffee and long regrets. A man haunted by his own name, reduced from legend to a cautionary note in a business school lecture. And me, I kept the promise I'd made without saying it aloud. I took the pieces he'd broken and put them into work that could heal. The Laura Reed Foundation started as an idea on paper and grew into shelters, legal aid, and scholarships for women rebuilding their lives. We turned a corrupted empire into refuge. Sometimes I go to her grave. There's a stone with her name and a small bouquet that never looks quite enough. I talk to her like I used to when I was a boy, who still thought adults could fix everything. Mom, justice took time, but I did it. For you, family isn't about blood. It's about the people who protect you, even when they're gone. And sometimes revenge isn't about destroying someone. It's about taking back the life they tried to steal from you. If this story hit you, the slow burn, the payoff, the price, there are more like it. Hit subscribe and join me on Ultimate Revenge. We bring you real stories of betrayal, justice, and the quiet ways people rebuild. The truth always finds a way out. Stay with me. There's one more story. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Comment below.